when two-way data binding happens or your model changes, how does HTML know? I mean, how does your view know? How does your view model know? How does anything know that something has changed? Well, AngularJS works on basically the concept of dirty checking. I've mentioned that earlier. And how that works is through a digest cycle. Is that something has happened, a digest cycle is kicked off. It will go through and say what has changed. And so based on what is on scope, is it knows, like, we're watching these things. So it has a list already. It's very content or model aware of what exists on scope. And it will go through and compare, has this changed? Has this value changed from the previous value? If not, then it just ignores it. But if it has, is that it kicks off basically an event watcher, which is a function or something to happen when those two values are not the same. There are times where things will happen outside of the AngularJS scope. So if you are using like a jQuery plugin and it does something, it modifies some value, well, the Angular application perimeter is not going to know about that. So what you can do is manually kick off that digest cycle using apply. So you can call $digest, but it's recommended that you do not do that, that you use apply. And the reason being is because you can actually wrap that. It actually has error handling built into it. And so you can actually have a function where it'll try to apply it, and if it fails, then it won't fail silently. And so it's recommended within the view, or if you're doing that within your application, to use apply. And so kind of the native event cycle or the event loop is something happened in DOM, which then kicked off a callback in JavaScript. JavaScript would do something, possibly modify the DOM, and then relinquish control back to your HTML. So you kind of had this kind of back and forth. It's like HTML, this is something, you need to do something. Then the JavaScript would do whatever and hand it back. AngularJS has created a loop on top of that, which is the digest cycle. And so what happens is, when something has happened, is it runs through and says, we need to go through and compare everything. So actually, this is kind of the genesis of it. So like ng click, it'll be like, do this thing. So you'll have certain things that'll kick it off. So that's what this apply function will say, go and do this particular thing. From there, is it kicks off this digest loop, which is two sub kind of loops under the hood that's happening within. So when we say digest cycle, it's actually two things. Is one, you have this watch list that's going through and saying, these are the things that have changed. Then you have this eval async queue that will go through and fire off the event watchers based on the thing that has changed. And then once that is done, so once these two loops are basically stable, so nothing has changed, there's nothing left in the watch list, it will then exit. That's as far as I'm going to get into it. I think if I went any farther, everybody's eyes would just gloss over and just be like, oh my gosh, way too much theory. But the point is that it basically goes through, compares values, and if something has changed, then it will kick off a function and do something. So you can manually set that up to say, when this thing is changed, do it. So you can actually hook into it and manually do that and say, for instance, scope watch this property. When this property is changed, here's my function. So it looks very much like a callback, because that's essentially kind of what's happening under the hood. At the same time, is a lot of these are created implicitly, and it just happens. And so the two values may either be like, we're comparing two strict like native values, like like a native type, like does this number equal this number? Or you can pair two results of two functions. So the interesting thing about this is a little kind of facet that I found interesting about Angular is you can not only bind to values, but you can bind to methods, which creates some very interesting things because you're actually binding to the result of the method. So for instance, if you are saying, I want to show this based on these three different things, I've actually seen HTML where it's like ng show if this is true and this is false and this is true. Well, now you're putting kind of your logic back in your HTML. You can wrap that all up in a function and bind to that. And so I will often actually bind to functions instead of kind of simple values. And so from there, you can exert like any kind of control over your logic of the result of that and bind to it. So it's pretty powerful stuff.